The night I lost my job, my father dragged my suitcase onto the wet pavement of our driveway, looked me dead in the eye, and told me that my sister needed winners in her life, not burdens. I walked away into the freezing rain, entirely homeless in their eyes. What they did not know was that the worn-out leather briefcase clutched in my hand held the documents that gave me the power to take their company, their inflated paychecks, and their precious Nantucket beach house away overnight. My name is Claire Adams. I am 31 years old, and I work as a senior financial risk accountant. I have spent my entire adult life balancing ledgers, minimizing corporate liabilities, and protecting assets for the people I loved. Yet, for all my rigorous professional training, I completely missed the massive, devastating fraud happening right inside my own family. I missed it because I let blood ties blind me to the truth. That blindness ended the night my father threw me out like last week's trash. The nightmare started 12 hours earlier in the executive suite of Sterling Supply Company. Sterling Supply was a regional logistics and warehousing firm my grandfather built from the ground up. For the past 5 years, I had been working there as the senior accountant. It was a title that sounded impressive, but my paycheck told a very different story. I worked 60-hour weeks for a salary that barely covered my basic living expenses. I spent my weekends constantly stepping in to fix supply chain errors, negotiating with angry vendors, and balancing the books when the accounts ran dangerously low. I did it because my father, Richard, constantly reminded me that the business was struggling to survive. "We were family," he would say with a heavy sigh, "and family makes sacrifices to keep the ship afloat." So I sacrificed everything. I skipped vacations. I drove a 10-year-old sedan with a rattling engine. I lived in the small, drafty guest house at the back of my parents' estate just to save on rent so I could pour more of my time and energy into saving the company. I believed I was doing the right thing, but that afternoon, my father called me into his office. Sitting across from him was Blake. Blake was my younger sister's fiancé. He was a slick, smooth-talking corporate climber who wore custom Italian suits that cost more than my monthly salary. My father had recently appointed Blake as the Chief Operating Officer, a high-paying position Blake had absolutely zero qualifications for. I sat down in the heavy leather guest chair, holding a stack of quarterly reports I had stayed up all night preparing. I was ready to show them a strategy to cut warehouse costs. Before I could even open the folder, my father took a deep breath, steepled his fingers, and gave me a look of practiced sympathy. "Claire," he said, his voice dripping with false regret. "You know how hard things have been lately. The freight costs are up. Client retention is down. We are bleeding capital, and we have to tighten our belts across the board to survive this quarter." I nodded, fully prepared to suggest taking a temporary pay cut. I had done it before when times were lean. I opened my mouth to offer, but he raised his hand to stop me. "That is why," my father continued coldly, "we have to let you go. Effective immediately." The words did not process at first. I stared at him, then at Blake, who was busy examining his expensive watch, completely unbothered. I asked my father what he meant. I ran the entire accounting department single-handedly. I managed the audits. If they let me go, there would be absolutely no one left to manage the payroll, the complicated tax filings, or the vendor accounts. My father sighed heavily, acting as though my confusion was a massive inconvenience to his busy day. "Blake is going to absorb your duties," he said smoothly. "We are restructuring the executive team. It is strictly a financial decision, Claire. We need the capital to stay afloat, and your salary is a liability we can no longer afford." I sat there stunned into silence, but my analytical mind started spinning, and the pieces simply did not fit together. If the company was on the brink of total collapse, how were they paying Blake's massive executive salary? How was Blake driving a brand new leased sports car on the company dime? More importantly, how were they paying for Chloe's wedding? My younger sister Chloe was the undisputed golden child of the family. She was 26, effortlessly beautiful, and had never held a real job in her life. She was marrying Blake in exactly 1 week, and the wedding was not just a simple, elegant ceremony. It was a massive, opulent affair at a private beachfront estate in Nantucket. The catering alone cost more than my yearly salary. They had hired a celebrity event planner, booked a luxury yacht for the rehearsal dinner, and imported thousands of rare white orchids. The total price tag was well over $100,000. I looked my father in the eye and asked him directly. I asked how a struggling logistics company could possibly afford a $100,000 party in Nantucket when they supposedly could not afford my meager accountant salary. My father's face flushed crimson. The sympathetic mask vanished entirely. He slammed his hand flat on his polished mahogany desk, causing my reports to jump. "That is none of your business," he snapped viciously. "Your sister is marrying into a prominent corporate family. We have a reputation to maintain in this town. This wedding is an investment in our future." "You are just a bean counter, Claire. You do not understand high-level business strategy or public relations," Blake chimed in, leaning back in his chair with a smug, arrogant grin. "Look, Claire," he said casually, "you are just an expense on the spreadsheet right now. Chloe and I are building a brand. We need the corporate resources to secure our network. You should be happy for your sister instead of counting our pennies." I was not just being fired, I was being sacrificed to fund my sister's extravagant lifestyle. I stood up, my hands trembling with a mix of profound betrayal and sheer disbelief. I left the office without another word, drove back to the estate, and went straight to the guest house to process what had just happened. I thought the firing was the absolute worst of it. I thought my family had hit their lowest point. I was completely wrong. The true cruelty was waiting for me at home. When I pushed open the front door of the guest house, I stopped dead in my tracks. The small living room was a disaster zone. My books, my winter coats, and my personal belongings were being hastily shoved into heavy black trash bags. Standing in the center of the room was my mother, Susan. She was wearing her pristine white tennis outfit, pointing aggressively as she directed a pair of hired movers to strip the sheets off my bed. I dropped my keys on the counter, the sound echoing sharply in the small room. I asked her what on earth she was doing with my things. My mother turned to me completely unfazed. Her expression was as cold and hard as marble. "Oh, good you are back," she said breezily, not an ounce of guilt in her voice. "Richard called and told me the news about your job. Since you are no longer employed at the company, it does not make sense for you to live on the estate. You need to pack the rest of your things right now." I stepped forward, my chest tight with rising panic. "Mom, I have lived here for 3 years. You cannot just throw me out on the street with zero notice." "Where am I supposed to go tonight?" She waved a manicured hand dismissively. "You are a smart girl, Claire. You will find a cheap apartment somewhere. Chloe and Blake need this space." The words hit me like a physical blow. Chloe and Blake, they were taking my home. As if on cue, the front door swung open again, and my sister Chloe walked in. She was holding a clipboard and a tape measure, already evaluating the dimensions of the space. She completely ignored me, pointing to the wall where my bookshelf stood. "Blake is going to want his exercise bike right there," she announced to our mother. "And we need to rip out this ugly beige carpet immediately. It is absolutely hideous and it smells like cheap perfume." I stood in the center of my own living room, watching my mother and my sister erase my existence, as if I was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. I turned to Chloe, my voice barely above a whisper. I asked her how she could do this. I told her I had spent years helping build the company that paid for her entire life. I had covered for her when she overdrew her credit cards. I had supported this family quietly and fiercely while she partied. Chloe finally looked at me. She did not look guilty. She looked profoundly annoyed. "Oh, please, Claire, stop being so dramatic. You have always been jealous of me. Blake and I are starting a high-profile life together. We are going to be hosting important people here. We cannot have you lurking around the property looking like a depressed spinster." "It is incredibly bad energy for my wedding week." My mother nodded in agreement, placing a hand on Chloe's shoulder. "Your sister is right, Claire. This is a very stressful time for her with the wedding, only a week away. We do not need your negativity ruining her special moment. Grab your bags. The movers need to bring in the new luxury furniture this evening." I did not scream. I did not cry. Crying would have shown them that they had the power to break me, and I absolutely refused to give them that satisfaction. I walked into my bedroom, grabbed my small rolling suitcase, and packed whatever professional clothing I could fit. I grabbed my toiletries, a few meaningful photographs of my late grandmother, and my heavy leather briefcase. That briefcase held my laptop and a stack of incredibly important legal documents that I kept with me at all times. By the time I walked out of the guest house, the sky had broken open. A cold, miserable rain was pouring down, slicking the pavement of the long, winding driveway. My father had just arrived home from the office. His luxury sedan was parked near the main house. He stood under the grand, well-lit portico, watching me drag my suitcase through the freezing rain. He did not step out to help me. He did not offer me an umbrella. He just watched me with a look of utter disdain. I paused at the end of the driveway, the freezing rain soaking through my thin blazer. I looked back at the man who had raised me, the man I had worked so tirelessly to protect from his own bad business decisions. I asked him if this was really how it was going to end. After everything I had done for the family, was he really going to let his own daughter walk away into the storm? My father crossed his arms over his chest. He looked me dead in the eye, and his words cut through the sound of the pouring rain with absolute precision. "You brought this on yourself, Claire," he said loudly. "You refuse to be a team player. You refuse to see the bigger picture. Chloe is about to elevate this entire family into a new social class. She needs winners around her right now. We cannot afford dead weight. Dead weight." That is what I was to them. I was not a daughter. I was not a loyal employee who had sacrificed her 20s for their comfort. I was just dead weight that needed to be cut loose so they could sail away on their rented yacht in Nantucket. I did not say another word. I turned my back on my father, on my mother, and on the sister who had happily stolen my home. I walked down the long driveway as the rain plastered my hair to my face. My shoes splashed through the deep puddles, but I barely felt the biting cold. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully disposed of the quiet, boring accountant so they could live out their high society fantasies unhindered. They thought I was walking away completely broken, entirely homeless, and completely powerless. But as I walked through the storm, my grip tightened on the handle of my worn-out leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was a secure flash drive and a stack of confidential legal papers. Papers with heavy corporate seals. Papers with notarized signatures that could not be undone. My family thought they were throwing out a useless employee to protect their company's cash flow, but what they did not know, what they could not possibly comprehend, was the secret I had been keeping for the past 3 years. They did not know that Richard was not the owner of Sterling Supply Company. They did not know that the luxury estate they were currently standing in and the beautiful beach house in Nantucket, where they planned to host their $100,000 wedding, did not belong to them. I walked into the darkness completely silent, letting the freezing rain wash away the last remaining shreds of my loyalty to those people. I was homeless in their eyes, yes, but the truth was a very different story. The truth was locked inside my briefcase, ready to be unleashed. They wanted winners. They were about to learn what losing everything truly looked like. The heater in my 10-year-old sedan was notoriously unreliable. It rattled and hissed, pushing only a faint breath of lukewarm air into the freezing cabin. I shivered as the heavy rain lashed against the windshield, blurring the red taillights of the cars ahead of me. The rhythmic mechanical thud of the wiper blades was the only sound inside the quiet car. Beside me, on the worn fabric of the passenger seat, sat my heavy leather briefcase. I found myself glancing at it every time a passing streetlight washed over the interior of the car. That briefcase was the only thing anchoring me to reality. As I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white and aching from the cold, the sheer absurdity of the situation washed over me. My father had just thrown me out into a storm. My mother had watched with cold satisfaction. My sister had complained that my presence was bad energy for her upcoming wedding. They had discarded me like a broken piece of furniture because they believed I was a financial burden they could no longer afford to carry. What they did not know, and what they could not possibly comprehend, was that I was the only reason they had a roof over their heads. To understand the magnitude of their betrayal, you have to go back 3 years. It was a Tuesday evening in late November. I was living in downtown Boston at the time, working at a highly respected corporate accounting firm. I had spent my 20s climbing the ladder, building a robust retirement portfolio, investing in solid index funds, and saving every spare dollar. I was independent, successful, and secure. Then my father called me. He asked me to come to the family estate immediately. When I walked into his home office that night, he was not the arrogant, chest-puffing executive who had just fired me hours ago. He was a completely broken man. He was sitting behind his grand mahogany desk, his face buried in his hands, openly weeping. Sterling Supply Company was drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. The supply chain disruptions had bled their cash reserves dry. The vendors had cut them off entirely. The banks had refused to extend their credit lines and were actively preparing to force the company into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. My father looked at me with red, tear-filled eyes and confessed that they were going to lose everything. The business my grandfather built, the family estate, their pristine reputation in the local country club community. It was all going to be wiped out. Seeing my father cry broke my heart. Despite the favoritism they had always shown my sister, despite the way my mother constantly criticized my practical lifestyle, they were still my family. I loved them. I believed that family stepped up when things got dark. I did what any loving, loyal daughter would do. I decided to save them. But I also knew my father intimately. He was a fiercely proud man, a traditional patriarch who measured his entire self-worth by his business title and his financial dominance. He would never be able to stomach the profound humiliation of being bailed out by his youngest daughter. If he knew I was the one saving him, his ego would never recover. He would resent me forever. So I engineered a completely silent rescue. I resigned from my prestigious job in Boston. I liquidated my entire investment portfolio. I emptied my savings accounts. I even cashed out my 401k, absorbing the massive early withdrawal penalties and the brutal tax hits without a second thought. I drained every single penny I had spent a decade earning. I took all of that capital and I hired a top-tier corporate attorney named Samantha. Together, we established a private, anonymous blind trust. I named the trust Apex Holdings. Operating through Samantha and the veil of corporate privacy laws, Apex Holdings swooped in at the 11th hour. We purchased all of Sterling Supply Company's outstanding commercial debt. We injected a massive wave of fresh capital to pay off the angry vendors and stabilize the payroll. We legally assumed total ownership of the corporate assets. But the commercial debt was not the only fire I had to put out. In his desperation to keep the business afloat, my father had secretly leveraged their beloved Nantucket beach house. The bank was only weeks away from initiating foreclosure proceedings on the property. That beach house was my mother's absolute pride and joy. It was the centerpiece of her social life, the place where she hosted her elite summer parties. Losing it would have destroyed her. Through Apex Holdings, I quietly paid off the defaulted mortgage. In the process, the legal deed to the Nantucket beach house was transferred directly into the name of my holding company to shelter it from any remaining creditors. When the dust finally settled, the reality of the situation was absolute. Legally, Sterling Supply Company belonged entirely to Apex Holdings. The Nantucket beach house belonged to Apex Holdings, and Apex Holdings belonged entirely to me. My father was no longer a business owner. He was a salaried employee. He was a puppet chief executive officer operating at the pleasure of a faceless corporate entity. But he never knew the truth. Samantha handled all the legal paperwork and the corporate restructuring. My father was led to believe that a massive private equity firm out of Chicago had recognized his inherent business genius, acquired the debt, and decided to keep him on as the head of the company to steer the ship back to profitability. His ego was not just protected, it was completely inflated. He walked around telling his country club friends that major investors had begged him to stay on board. To maintain this elaborate illusion, I needed to keep a close eye on the daily finances. So I took a position at the newly rescued Sterling Supply as a senior accountant. I intentionally paid myself a meager entry-level salary. I did this because the company was still in a fragile recovery phase, and I needed to keep the corporate overhead as low as possible. I moved into the tiny guest house on their property simply to save on rent, so the business could retain more operating cash. For 3 long years, I played my part perfectly. I played the role of the quiet, unremarkable accountant. I worked late into the night, balancing the ledgers. I negotiated lower rates with our suppliers. I carefully managed the cash flow to ensure my father never had to experience the terror of missing a payroll run again. And in return, I endured their constant, exhausting condescension. I sat silently at family dinners while my mother praised my sister Chloe for her glamorous lifestyle, then turned to me and sighed about my lack of ambition. I listened to Chloe mock my sensible clothing and my 10-year-old sedan. I watched my father parade around the office in custom suits, acting like a titan of industry, while he treated me like a glorified secretary. I swallowed my pride every single day. I accepted their disrespect because I believed that my silent sacrifice was keeping our family safe. I kept the secret locked away. I never intended to reveal it. I was prepared to spend the rest of my career quietly managing the company from the shadows, ensuring they could live out their comfortable, wealthy lives until the day they died. But tonight, that illusion was shattered. Tonight, they threw me out into the freezing rain because they believed I was a financial liability that threatened their social climbing ambitions. I took my foot off the gas pedal as the glowing neon sign of a cheap roadside motel came into view through the pouring rain. I pulled my old sedan into the cracked asphalt parking lot, the tires splashing through deep puddles. The building looked tired and worn, a stark contrast to the grand gated estate I had just been evicted from. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against the metal roof. I grabbed my suitcase from the back seat and tucked my leather briefcase tightly under my arm to protect it from the weather. I walked into the brightly lit sterile lobby and paid for a room using my debit card. The night clerk handed me a plastic key card without even looking up. My room was on the second floor at the very end of a long exterior walkway. I pushed the heavy door open and flipped the light switch. The room smelled faintly of stale smoke and harsh cleaning chemicals. The carpet was a faded, depressing brown. The bed sagged in the middle under a thin, scratchy bedspread. This was where the owner of a multi-million-dollar logistics company and a luxury Nantucket beach estate was spending the night. I dropped my suitcase near the door. I walked over to the small, scratched wooden desk in the corner of the room and carefully set down my leather briefcase. I took off my soaked blazer and draped it over the back of the plastic chair. I was shivering, exhausted, and deeply heartbroken. The pain of my father's parting words still echoed loudly in my ears. He had called me dead weight. I sat down on the edge of the sagging mattress. I brought my hands to my face and wiped away the mixture of freezing rain and tears from my cheeks. I allowed myself exactly 2 minutes to feel the profound grief of losing my family. I mourned the parents I thought I had. I mourned the sister I had tried so hard to protect. When the 2 minutes were up, I took a deep, shaky breath. The profound sadness in my chest began to recede, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and intensely clinical focus. I was no longer the discarded daughter crying in a cheap motel room. I was a senior financial risk accountant. I was the supreme owner of Apex Holdings. I stood up and walked over to the wooden desk. I unclasped the brass locks on my leather briefcase. The sound was loud and decisive in the quiet room. I pulled out my laptop, plugged it into the wall outlet, and connected to the secure mobile hotspot on my phone. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I navigated past the standard employee login portal for Sterling Supply Company. I bypassed the regional server completely. Instead, I accessed a hidden, highly encrypted gateway. I typed in my master credentials. I entered my 2-factor authentication codes. The screen blinked and the supreme administrative dashboard for Apex Holdings loaded in front of me. As the sole owner and ultimate authority of the holding company, this dashboard gave me unrestricted, invisible access to every single financial transaction, every internal email, and every hidden ledger within Sterling Supply Company. I stared at the glowing screen, my analytical mind racing. My father had claimed the company was bleeding capital. He had claimed they needed to fire me to survive the quarter, but I knew the baseline revenue. I knew the operational margins. The business had been stable when I filed the monthly reports just 2 weeks ago. There was absolutely no logical reason for a sudden catastrophic cash flow crisis, unless the crisis was manufactured. My father and his new chief operating officer, my future brother-in-law Blake, had forcefully removed the only person in the entire company who actively monitored the daily accounts. They had removed the watchdog. There had to be a reason why they needed me out of the building so abruptly. There had to be a paper trail explaining how they planned to pay for a $100,000 wedding in Nantucket when the corporate accounts were supposedly running dry. I moved my cursor over to the master financial directory. I clicked on the executive expense accounts and the raw banking ledgers. The loading icon spun for a brief second. I sat forward in the plastic chair, my eyes narrowing as the raw financial data filled the screen, ready to see exactly what my father and Blake had been hiding in the shadows of my company. The blue light of my laptop screen cast a harsh glow against the peeling wallpaper of the cheap motel room. I sat frozen in the stiff plastic chair at a scratched wooden desk. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I had just bypassed the standard employee network of Sterling Supply Company and entered the master administrative portal of Apex Holdings. As the sole owner and creator of the Blind Trust, I possessed the highest level of security clearance. I could see absolutely everything. Every dollar coming in, every dollar going out, every hidden ledger my father thought was perfectly secure. My father had looked me directly in the eye just hours ago and told me the company was bleeding capital. He had claimed the freight costs were crippling our margins. He had justified throwing his own daughter out into the freezing rain because we were supposedly on the brink of total financial collapse. I opened the master profit and loss statement for the current fiscal quarter. I expected to see red ink. I expected to see the devastating losses he had so dramatically lamented in his office. Instead, I saw a company that was thriving. The gross revenue was not down. It was up by 12% compared to the exact same quarter last year. The supply chain disruptions he had complained about had been fully resolved months ago. The major client accounts were completely paid and entirely up to date. Sterling Supply Company was generating a massive surplus of cash. The business was healthier and more profitable than it had been in over a decade. I stared at the numbers, my heart pounding a heavy, erratic rhythm against my ribs. If the company was generating record profits, why was the operating cash flow dropping so rapidly? Where was all the money going? I switched tabs and opened the raw banking ledgers. I sorted the outgoing corporate transactions by date, focusing heavily on the past 3 months. This was the exact time frame when my father had abruptly appointed Blake as the chief operating officer. At the time, I had assumed it was just rampant, foolish nepotism. Blake was a smooth-talking corporate climber with zero actual experience in logistics management, but he was marrying my sister Chloe, so my father gave him a corner office and a massive executive salary. I had swallowed my pride and accepted it to keep the peace. Now looking at the transaction logs, the dark and terrible truth began to emerge. Blake had not been hired to run the company. Blake had been hired to help my father steal from it. I started tracking the outgoing wire transfers from the main corporate operating account. As the senior accountant, I intimately knew every legitimate vendor we worked with. I knew the freight companies, the packaging suppliers, and the routine maintenance contractors. But the names appearing on these recent wire transfers were completely foreign to me. There was a payment for $24,000 to a company called Atlantic Coastal Management. The expense was coded in the ledger as a corporate leadership and team-building retreat. I pulled up the attached invoice. It was heavily redacted, but the routing numbers matched a luxury resort management group located in the Bahamas. My mind flashed back to last month. Chloe had gone on a lavish 2-week bachelorette trip to the Bahamas with 6 of her closest friends. She had bragged endlessly on social media about the private beachfront villas and the endless bottles of champagne, claiming Blake had spoiled her beyond belief. Blake had not spoiled her. He had used my company to fund a $24,000 vacation, cleverly disguised as a corporate training expense. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I could not stop looking. My hands flew across the keyboard, downloading every single fraudulent invoice, pulling every forged signature, and saving every compromised document. I found another wire transfer. $35,000 sent to a vendor listed as Maritime Logistics Solutions. The expense category was marked as secure warehousing deposits. I cross-referenced the business identification number through a public registry. It did not belong to a warehousing firm. It belonged to a premier luxury yacht charter company operating out of Nantucket. It was the exact same yacht charter company Chloe had proudly booked for her opulent rehearsal dinner next week. My father and Blake had stolen $35,000 from the corporate reserves to pay for a floating cocktail party. The sheer audacity of their crimes was breathtaking. They were not even trying to be clever or sophisticated. They were relying entirely on the fact that my father had supreme authority over the local accounting department. They assumed no one would ever dare to question the chief executive officer. I kept digging, my eyes burning from the harsh light of the screen. I found $12,000 funneled to an international import company coded as warehouse supplies and seasonal inventory. A quick search revealed it was actually a boutique floral importer based in Europe. They had bought thousands of rare white orchids for the wedding ceremony using company money. I found massive catering deposits coded as client entertainment. I found payments for custom-tailored suits disguised as corporate uniforms. I found invoices for luxury car leases hidden under fleet vehicle maintenance. In total, I traced over $120,000 that had been aggressively and carelessly embezzled from the company accounts in just 3 short months. Every single fraudulent transaction had been initiated by Blake and officially approved with my father's signature. They were bleeding the company dry to fund my sister's perfect high society wedding. They were treating the business I had sacrificed my entire life savings to rescue as their own personal piggy bank. And then, the final devastating piece of the puzzle snapped into place. I leaned back in the uncomfortable plastic motel chair, staring blankly at the water-stained ceiling. The realization washed over me cold and perfectly clear. They had not fired me because the company was struggling. They had not fired me because I was a financial burden. They had fired me because I was the senior financial risk accountant. Next week was the official end of the fiscal quarter. As part of my standard job duties, I would have been required to conduct a full comprehensive reconciliation of the corporate ledgers. I would have been required to audit the executive expense reports. I would have seen the missing $120,000 instantly. I would have demanded the original receipts for the phantom warehouse supplies and the fake leadership retreats. I would have uncovered the embezzlement within a matter of days. I was not a financial liability. I was a massive ticking time bomb to their criminal enterprise. They needed me out of the building before the quarterly audit began. They needed me stripped of my system access, so I could not see the fraudulent paper trail they had carelessly left behind. Throwing me out of the guest house was just the final cruel step to ensure I was completely severed from the family and the business before the wedding took place. They wanted me entirely broken, isolated, and powerless, so I would never have the strength or the resources to question their sudden financial windfall. The absolute cruelty of it paralyzed me. My own father had looked at me with tears in his eyes 3 years ago, begging me to save him from bankruptcy and public humiliation. I had given him everything I had. I had lived in a drafty, cramped guest house. I had driven a broken-down car. I had worked 60-hour weeks for pennies, and he had thanked me by stealing the very money I had used to save him all, to shower his golden child with a lifestyle she had never earned. He had looked me in the eye in the pouring rain just hours ago and told me my sister needed winners. He had discarded me without a single second thought. A profound, burning anger ignited deep in my chest. It was not the chaotic, noisy anger of a misunderstood teenager. It was the deep, quiet, and terrifying wrath of an adult woman who realizes she holds the absolute power to destroy the people who hurt her. I spent the next several hours working with relentless mechanical precision. I did not shed another tear. I downloaded the entire corporate ledger. I captured high-resolution screenshots of every forged approval signature from my father. I compiled the phantom invoices, the bank routing numbers, and the corresponding social media posts from Chloe that perfectly matched the exact dates and amounts of the embezzled funds. I built an airtight, irrefutable digital dossier of their financial crimes. I uploaded multiple encrypted backups to secure cloud servers. I was not just building a case to confront my family. I was building a case for a federal fraud investigator. By the time I finished organizing the final folder of digital evidence, the sky outside the motel window was beginning to lighten. The heavy, violent rain had slowed to a steady, rhythmic drizzle. The harsh fluorescent sign from the parking lot flickered and buzzed before finally turning off. It was exactly 7:00 in the morning. I closed my laptop and rubbed my exhausted, burning eyes. My body ached terribly from sitting in the rigid plastic chair all night. I felt entirely hollowed out, as if the family I had known my entire life had been completely erased, replaced by greedy, unrecognizable strangers wearing their faces. The betrayal was so absolute, so thoroughly and coldly calculated, that it literally made my chest physically ache. I stood up to stretch my stiff legs, walking slowly toward the small window to look out at the gray morning light. I needed to call my corporate attorney, Samantha. I needed to initiate the legal process of freezing their company accounts and revoking their executive privileges. I needed to officially take back my company. Just as I turned toward the desk to retrieve my phone, the screen lit up brightly in the dim room. A loud, jarring ringtone broke the morning silence. I stared at the caller identification flashing on the screen. It was my mother. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen in the center of the cheap motel room. A tiny, pathetic, completely irrational part of my heart sparked with sudden hope. She was calling at 7 in the morning. Maybe she had spent the entire night lying awake, consumed by overwhelming guilt. Maybe she had realized how truly monstrous it was to throw her own daughter out into a freezing storm. Maybe she was calling to apologize, to beg me to come back home, to tell me that firing me and evicting me had been a terrible, unforgivable mistake. I walked over to the desk and picked up the phone. My hand was trembling slightly as I swiped the screen to accept the call. I brought the phone to my ear, waiting to hear her voice soften with regret. I was waiting for the apology that might have changed everything. I was entirely wrong. The harsh glare of the motel room lamp illuminated the cracked glass of my phone screen. The name flashing brightly in the dim light was Susan Adams, my mother. For a fleeting second, a foolish, desperate part of my heart whispered that maybe she was calling to check on me. Maybe the reality of the freezing storm outside had finally broken through her cold exterior. Maybe she had spent the entire night lying awake, consumed by overwhelming guilt after watching my father throw me out onto the wet driveway. I swallowed hard, swiped the screen to accept the call, and brought the phone to my ear. I held my breath, waiting for a single shred of maternal concern. I was waiting for the apology that might have changed everything. I was entirely wrong. Wrong. There was no warmth waiting for me on the other end of the line. There was no hesitation. There was not a single question about my safety, my whereabouts, or my physical well-being. Claire, my mother, said, her tone brisk, sharp, and entirely businesslike. She sounded exactly the way she spoke to service workers when she was demanding a refund. "I am so glad you answered your phone. We have a slight emergency on our hands here at the estate, and you need to handle it immediately." I sat completely still on the edge of the sagging motel mattress. I stared at the peeling brown wallpaper, my mind struggling to process the sheer absurdity of her opening statement. I asked her what kind of emergency could possibly be more important than the fact that she had just watched my father throw me out of my own home and fire me from my job just 12 hours ago. My mother sighed heavily into the receiver. The sound was thick with profound irritation, as if my attempt to bring up my sudden eviction was nothing more than a tedious distraction from her busy schedule. "Oh, please, Claire, do not be so dramatic," my mother snapped impatiently. "You are a grown woman. You can manage to survive a few nights in a hotel. We have a real crisis happening right now. The premium wine vendor for Chloe's wedding is threatening to cancel the entire order for the rehearsal dinner. They are demanding a final deposit payment of $20,000 this morning. If they do not get the money by noon, they are pulling the imported champagne for the Nantucket reception. I asked her why she was telling me this. I reminded her that I had just been fired from Sterling Supply Company. I was no longer the senior accountant. I had absolutely no access to the corporate budget, the business credit cards, or the vendor payment portals. My mother clicked her tongue, a sound radiating pure condescension. I am not asking you to use the company accounts, Claire. Your father already explained to you that the business cash flow is tied up right now. I am telling you to take out a personal loan. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her demand paralyzed me. The silence stretched between us as my brain tried to comprehend the magnitude of her entitlement. She wanted me, the daughter she had just rendered unemployed and homeless, to walk into a bank and take out a high-interest personal loan. She wanted me to go into massive debt to buy luxury champagne for the sister who had happily stolen my guest house. You have that pristine credit score? My mother continued smoothly, completely oblivious to my stunned silence. You have always been so obsessed with saving your money and building your credit history. Well, now is the time to actually use it for something that truly matters. You can easily secure a $20,000 personal loan by noon today. We will pay you back eventually, of course. I finally found my voice. It came out low, tight, and completely exhausted. I told her I was absolutely not going to take on massive personal debt to fund a lavish wedding party. I reminded her again that I had no job and no home. The line went dead quiet for 3 seconds before my mother unleashed a masterclass in emotional extortion. I cannot believe how incredibly selfish you are being right now, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom and outrage. This is your sister's wedding, Claire. This is the absolute most important week of her entire life. We are talking about blood loyalty. We are talking about family duty. After everything your father and I sacrificed to raise you, after putting a roof over your head and food on your plate, for all those years you are going to sit there and refuse to help us in our hour of need. You are willingly choosing to ruin Chloe's dream day over a simple bank loan. You have always been so ungrateful. When my mother invoked the phrase blood loyalty, it felt like a sick joke. Where was that blood loyalty 12 hours ago when it was freezing outside and I was dragging my suitcase down the driveway? Where was the family duty when she watched her husband fire me to protect a thief? Blood loyalty in her mind only flowed in one direction. It flowed directly from my bank account into her pockets. Sitting in that freezing motel room with the master administrative ledger of Apex Holdings glowing on my laptop screen right in front of me, the final veil dropped from my eyes. I was looking directly at the documented proof that my father and Blake had stolen over $120,000 from the corporate accounts. They had more than enough stolen cash sitting in their hidden reserves to pay for the expensive wine. But they did not want to touch their precious stolen money. They wanted me to bleed for them. They wanted me to prove my total submission to the family hierarchy by completely destroying my own financial future. They viewed my excellent credit score not as my personal achievement, but as a family asset waiting to be exploited. I took a deep, steadying breath. The scared, eager-to-please daughter inside me died in that exact moment. What replaced her was the analytical, ruthless, and calculating mind of a senior financial risk accountant. No, I said. My voice was completely flat, drained of any fear, sadness, or hesitation. I'm not taking out a personal loan. I am not giving you a single dime of my money. You and Dad will have to figure out how to pay for your own extravagant parties. Before my mother could launch into another vicious tirade, I heard a sharp scuffle on the other end of the line. The phone was aggressively snatched away. Claire. You listen to me right now. A shrill, hysterical voice screamed into my ear. It was Chloe. My beautiful golden child sister was throwing a massive temper tantrum. You are doing this on purpose, Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing painfully through the small speaker of my phone. You have always been insanely jealous of me. You are just a bitter, miserable spinster who cannot stand the fact that I am marrying a wealthy, successful man while you have absolutely nothing to show for your pathetic life. You are actively trying to sabotage my Nantucket wedding because your own life is a boring, depressing tragedy. I held the phone slightly away from my ear, letting her toxic words wash over me without absorbing any of their poison. She accused me of hoarding my money like a greedy miser. She called me a colossal disappointment to the family name. She projected every single one of her own shallow insecurities directly onto me, screaming that I would never know what it felt like to be truly loved, truly successful, or truly important. You know what? Claire Chloe continued, panting heavily as she worked herself into a wild frenzy. Do not even bother showing up to the rehearsal dinner. Do not bother showing up to the ceremony. You are officially banned from my wedding. If you try to step foot on that Nantucket property, Blake will have his private security team throw you out into the street exactly like Dad did last night. We do not need a pathetic loser ruining our aesthetic and bringing down the mood of our guests. Consider yourself entirely cut off from this family. Do not ever call us again. The sheer delicious irony of her threat washed over me. Chloe was threatening to have me physically removed from a multi-million-dollar coastal estate that was legally registered under a blind trust that I had personally created and funded. She was threatening to forcefully expel the landlord from her own premises. The line went completely dead. A sharp final click echoed in the small motel room. They had hung up on me. They had delivered their ultimate punishment, absolutely certain that banning me from the high society wedding would shatter my spirit and put me firmly back in my place. They believed I was currently sitting on the edge of a cheap mattress, weeping uncontrollably, desperate to find a way back into their good graces. They fully expected me to call back in 10 minutes, sobbing and begging for forgiveness, promising to go to the bank and secure the loan just to be allowed back into the family circle. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap. The room was perfectly silent, save for the low mechanical hum of the cheap air conditioning unit rattling in the window. I did not cry. I did not shed a single tear. My sadness had completely evaporated, burned away by the sheer staggering heat of their boundless entitlement. In its place, a cold, clinical, and intensely righteous anger settled deeply into my bones. They had just declared war on the woman who owned the very ground they walked on. They had loudly banned me from a luxury beach estate that literally belonged to my holding company. They had called me a pathetic loser while spending stolen money from the corporate accounts that I legally controlled. They thought they held all the power, completely unaware that I held the keys to their entire kingdom. I picked up my phone again. My hands were no longer shaking. My posture was perfectly straight. I opened my contacts and tapped the name of Samantha, the brilliant cutthroat corporate attorney who exclusively represented Apex Holdings. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp, professional, and fully alert, despite the early morning hour. "Good morning, Claire," Samantha said smoothly. "To what do I owe the pleasure at this hour?" I looked at the glowing laptop screen, at the irrefutable, meticulously documented evidence of my father's embezzlement, and I made the decision that would end their world. "Samantha," I said, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering authority, "I need you to execute an immediate administrative override on the Sterling Supply Company accounts." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle before giving the final directive. I want you to freeze Richard and Blake's corporate expense accounts immediately. Cancel their platinum cards. Block their access to all executive checking and savings ledgers. Revoke all of their vendor payment authorizations. When the global banking system prompts you for a reason, you are to explicitly flag both of their profiles for critical financial fraud and internal embezzlement. Lock them out of everything. Samantha did not hesitate. She did not ask for an explanation. She knew me well enough to know I did not make these kinds of decisions lightly. "Consider it done, Claire," she replied, her keyboard already clacking in the background. "The hard freeze will take effect across the entire financial network within the next 10 minutes. They will not be able to buy a single cup of coffee on the company dime." I thanked her and ended the call. I set the phone down on the scratched wooden desk next to my laptop. The terrified, obedient daughter they had bullied and manipulated for 31 years was dead and gone. I was the supreme master of Apex Holdings, and the time for quiet sacrifice was officially over. The game had changed, and I was going to make sure they lost everything. The moment I ended the call with Samantha, the heavy silence of the cheap motel room settled around me. Outside, the freezing rain continued to beat against the single-pane window, but I no longer felt the cold. A strange, intoxicating warmth was spreading through my chest. For my entire life, I had been the family shock absorber. I had taken their insults, their financial burdens, and their endless demands, quietly absorbing the impact so they could live in ignorant bliss. Now I was finally pushing back. I sat forward in the stiff plastic chair and focused entirely on the glowing screen of my laptop. The master administrative portal for Apex Holdings was a beautiful, perfectly logical piece of software. It did not care about blood loyalty. It did not care about my mother's tantrums or my sister's social climbing ambitions. It only recognized authority, and I possessed the highest level of security clearance in the system. I navigated to the live transaction feed for Sterling Supply Company. This was the digital nerve center where every single swipe wire transfer and withdrawal was recorded in real time. I filtered the view to isolate the 2 platinum corporate credit cards assigned to my father and his new Chief Operating Officer, Blake. I knew exactly where they were at this very moment. Just an hour earlier, before she banned me from her life, Chloe had proudly broadcasted their location to her thousands of social media followers. They were having a lavish late-morning meet, the parents' brunch at the Orchid Country Club. It was the most exclusive, wildly expensive private club in the county. Blake's parents were old money, the kind of deeply intimidating, judgmental people who demanded perfection and ruthlessly evaluated everyone they met. My father was absolutely desperate to impress them. He needed to prove that the Addams family belonged in their elite social circle. He was undoubtedly planning to pay for a massively overpriced meal of imported caviar and vintage champagne, using my company money, eager to slide that heavy metal platinum card across the table with a smug, wealthy smile. I watched the digital clock on my laptop screen tick forward. It was just past 11 in the morning. The check would be arriving soon. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. The anticipation was electric. I had spent 3 years watching my father treat that corporate card like a magical, bottomless wishing well. He had used it to buy his tailored suits, to lease his luxury cars, and to fund my sister's extravagant lifestyle, all while telling me we could barely afford to keep the warehouse lights on. He believed he was completely untouchable. A sharp, high-pitched chime suddenly echoed from my laptop speakers. A new line of text populated at the very top of the live transaction feed. It was a charge authorization request from the Orchid Country Club dining room. The amount was for $1,420. Next to the amount, a bright glaring red status box flashed on the screen. Declined. I let out a slow, deeply satisfied breath. The trap had successfully snapped shut. I closed my eyes and pictured the scene unfolding miles away in that opulent chandelier-lit dining room. I could see the impeccably dressed waiter standing discreetly beside the table, holding the small black leather book. I could see my father casually waving his hand, telling Blake's wealthy parents that lunch was entirely his treat. I could see the waiter returning a few moments later, leaning down to politely whisper in my father's ear that there seemed to be a slight issue with his payment method. My laptop chimed a second time. My father was trying it again. He was undoubtedly blushing, letting out a booming, nervous laugh, and telling the table that the bank must have made a ridiculous security error. He probably wiped his card on his napkin and handed it right back to the waiter with a forced, arrogant smile. The second request appeared on my screen. $1,420. Declined. The panic would be setting in right about now. My father was a man who physically could not handle public humiliation. The absolute worst thing that could ever happen to him was appearing poor in front of rich people. The back of his neck would be sweating, staining the collar of his custom shirt. A third chime rang out. This time the card number was different. It was Blake's corporate platinum card. My father must have shot a desperate, panicked look at his future son-in-law, silently begging him to cover the humiliating disaster. Blake, always eager to play the hero in front of his intimidating parents, would have pulled out his own company card to save the day. The request hit the server. Declined. I sat back in my chair and actually smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had worn in months. They were stranded. They were sitting at a table with a massive bill, surrounded by elite society, and their magical money machine had suddenly turned to stone. They were completely stripped of the wealth they had stolen from me, but the country club lunch was only the very beginning of their nightmare. The digital dashboard suddenly lit up like a fireworks display. A rapid cascading series of chimes flooded the quiet motel room. It was not just the credit cards that Samantha had frozen. It was the entire corporate banking infrastructure. A scheduled wire transfer for $8,000 to a luxury floral importer hit the system. Declined. A payment request for $12,000 to a celebrity event catering company. Declined. A massive authorization attempt for $25,000 to the Nantucket Yacht Charter Service. Declined. The walls were violently closing in on them. Today was Friday. The Nantucket wedding was exactly 1 week away, and the final payment deadlines for every single extravagant vendor were scheduled for noon today. My mother had literally just screamed at me over the phone, demanding that I take out a personal loan to cover the wine vendor because they were facing a hard deadline. She had thought she was being clever by keeping the stolen corporate cash tucked away while trying to extort my personal credit. Now, every single penny of that stolen corporate cash was locked behind a digital fortress they could not breach. If those vendors did not receive their final payments in less than an hour, the imported orchids would not ship. The luxury yacht would be rented to someone else. The celebrity caterers would tear up their contract. The majestic high society wedding Chloe had spent a year bragging about was going to completely vaporize. My personal cell phone began to vibrate violently on the desk. I glanced at the screen. It was my father calling. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it started ringing again. Then Blake started calling. Then my mother. The screen lit up with a chaotic, endless stream of desperate notifications. They were trapped, and they knew I was the only accountant who understood how to fix the banking system. Hours ago, I was dead weight. Now I was their only lifeline. I muted the phone and shoved it face down. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a conversation. I wanted them to sit in the suffocating terror of their own making. A specialized alert suddenly flashed on my secondary monitor. It was a high-priority message arriving in the primary administrative inbox for Apex Holdings. This was the anonymous corporate email address that my father believed belonged to the massive Chicago private equity firm that owned his company. I opened the email. The subject line was marked urgent, written in all capital letters. The message from my father was frantic, completely stripped of his usual corporate arrogance. He wrote that there had been a catastrophic banking error. He demanded that the holding company immediately lift the restrictions on the executive accounts. He claimed that critical time-sensitive business operations were actively failing and that the bank was unfairly holding his operational funds hostage. He ended the email by trying to pull rank, reminding the anonymous owners that he was the chief executive officer and required instant access to his liquidity. He was absolutely terrified. The carefully constructed facade of his wealthy, untouchable life was crumbling in real time, and he was begging a faceless corporate entity to save him. I placed my fingers on the keyboard to type the reply. I felt absolutely no empathy. I felt no lingering guilt. The woman who would have rushed to fix this problem for him had died on the wet pavement of his driveway last night. I kept the response brief, entirely clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. I wanted it to sound like the cold, unfeeling machinery of a massive corporate compliance department. I typed the words, slowly savoring the profound weight of each keystroke. Account under investigation for fraudulent activity. All executive assets and corporate expense accounts have been frozen pending a full federal financial review. No further access will be granted at this time. I hit send. I watched the progress bar at the bottom of the screen indicate the message had successfully departed my server. I imagined my father sitting in the lobby of the country club, frantically refreshing his phone. I imagined the exact moment he opened that email. I imagined the blood completely draining from his face as he read the words, fraudulent activity and federal financial review. He knew exactly what he and Blake had done. He knew about the fake invoices. He knew about the stolen money. He knew that if anyone actually looked at the books, he was going to prison. The steady stream of phone calls from my family completely stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. My father was not a man who surrendered gracefully. He was a man utterly obsessed with appearances. He would rather burn the entire world to the ground than admit to Blake's wealthy parents that he was broke. He would never look Chloe in the eye and tell her that her dream wedding was canceled because he had been caught stealing. He was cornered. He had a massive unpayable bill at the country club. He had tens of thousands of dollars in wedding deadlines hitting in less than an hour. He had a frozen corporate account, and he was terrified of a looming fraud investigation. My father needed a massive amount of liquid cash, and he needed it immediately to cover his tracks and pay for the wedding. I knew his psychology perfectly. I knew that in his desperate, panicked state, he would look for the fastest, most secretive way to generate capital. He would look at the largest asset he mistakenly believed he still owned, the beautiful multi-million-dollar beach house in Nantucket. He believed his name was still on the deed. He believed he had the legal right to leverage that property. I sat back in my chair, staring at the dark screen of my muted phone, watching the digital footprint of a desperate man who was about to cross a severe legal line he could never uncross. The trap was set, the pressure was unbearable, and he was walking right into my hands. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the glowing screen of my laptop. For a moment, the world inside the small, shabby motel room ceased to exist. I was no longer Claire Adams, the discarded daughter freezing in a cheap roadside room. I was the sole owner and supreme administrator of Apex Holdings, and the digital ledger in front of me was a terrifying map of my family's deceit. Just hours ago, my father had looked me dead in the eye and told me our company, Sterling Supply Company, was bleeding capital. He claimed freight costs had crippled our margins, that the banks were tightening the noose, and that my modest salary as senior accountant was a liability the business could no longer afford to carry. He used that lie to fire me, and then he used it to justify throwing me out of my home. I clicked open the master profit and loss statement for the current fiscal quarter. I expected to see the catastrophic red ink he had so dramatically lamented. Instead, I saw a company that was practically printing cash. Gross revenue was actually up 12% from the same quarter last year. The supply chain disruptions he complained about had been resolved months ago. Major client accounts were paid and completely up to date. The business was healthier and more profitable than it had been in a decade. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. If the company was generating record profits, why was the operating cash flow dropping so severely? Where was all that money going? I switched tabs to the raw banking ledgers and filtered the outgoing corporate transactions for the last 3 months. This was the exact period when my father had abruptly appointed Blake as the chief operating officer. At the time, I assumed it was just foolish nepotism. Blake was my sister Chloe's fiancé, a smooth-talking corporate climber with absolutely no background in logistics management. My father gave him a corner office and a massive executive salary just to keep the peace. Now tracing the transaction logs, the dark reality began to emerge. Blake had not been hired to run the logistics company. He had been hired to help my father steal from it. I clicked on an outgoing wire transfer from the main operating account. As the senior accountant, I knew every legitimate vendor we worked with. I knew the freight companies, the packaging suppliers, and the routine maintenance contractors. But the names appearing on these recent transfers were completely foreign to me. There was a payment for $24,000 to a vendor called Atlantic Coastal Management. The expense was coded in the corporate ledger as a leadership and team-building retreat. I pulled up the attached invoice. The routing numbers matched a luxury resort management group located in the Bahamas. My mind flashed back to last month. Chloe had gone on a lavish 2-week bachelorette trip to the Bahamas with 6 of her closest friends. She bragged endlessly on social media about the private beachfront villas and the endless bottles of champagne, claiming Blake had spoiled her beyond belief. Blake had not spoiled her. He had used my company to fund a $24,000 vacation, cleverly disguised as a corporate training expense. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I felt a sudden wave of nausea, but I could not stop looking. My hands flew across the keyboard, downloading every fraudulent invoice, pulling every forged signature, and saving every compromised document. I found another wire transfer. $35,000 sent to a vendor listed as Maritime Logistics Solutions. The expense category was marked as secure warehousing deposits. I cross-referenced the business identification number through a public registry. It did not belong to a warehousing firm. It belonged to a premier luxury yacht charter company operating out of Nantucket. It was the exact same yacht company Chloe had proudly booked for her opulent rehearsal dinner next week. My father and Blake had stolen $35,000 from the corporate reserves to pay for a floating cocktail party. The sheer audacity of their crimes was breathtaking. They were not even trying to be clever or sophisticated. They relied entirely on the fact that my father had supreme authority over the local accounting department. They assumed no one would ever dare to question the chief executive officer. I kept digging, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the screen. I found $12,000 funneled to an international import company coded as warehouse supplies and seasonal inventory. A quick search revealed it was actually a boutique floral importer based in Europe. They had bought thousands of rare white orchids for the wedding ceremony using company money. I found massive catering deposits coded as client entertainment. I found payments for custom-tailored suits disguised as corporate uniforms. I found invoices for luxury car leases hidden under fleet vehicle maintenance. In total, I traced over $120,000 that had been aggressively and carelessly embezzled from the company accounts in just 3 short months. Every single fraudulent transaction had been initiated by Blake and officially approved with my father's signature. They were bleeding the company dry to fund my sister's perfect high society wedding. They were treating the business I had sacrificed my entire life savings to rescue as their own personal piggy bank. And then, the final devastating piece of the puzzle snapped into place. I leaned back in the uncomfortable plastic chair, staring blankly at the water-stained ceiling. The realization washed over me cold and perfectly clear. They had not fired me because the company was struggling. They had not fired me because I was a financial burden. They had fired me because I was the senior financial risk accountant. Next week was the official end of the fiscal quarter. As part of my standard job duties, I would have been required to conduct a full comprehensive reconciliation of the corporate ledgers. I would have been required to audit the executive expense reports. I would have seen the missing $120,000 instantly. I would have demanded the original receipts for the phantom warehouse supplies and the fake leadership retreats. I would have uncovered the embezzlement within a matter of days. I was not a financial liability. I was a massive ticking time bomb to their criminal enterprise. They needed me out of the building before the quarterly audit began. They needed me stripped of my system access, so I could not see the fraudulent paper trail they had carelessly left behind. Throwing me out of the guest house was just the final cruel step to ensure I was completely severed from the family and the business before the wedding took place. They wanted me entirely broken, isolated, and powerless, so I would never have the strength or the resources to question their sudden financial windfall. The absolute cruelty of it paralyzed me. My own father had looked at me with tears in his eyes 3 years ago, begging me to save him from bankruptcy and public humiliation. I had given him everything I had. I lived in a drafty, cramped guest house. I drove a broken-down car. I worked 60-hour weeks for pennies. And he thanked me by stealing the very money I used to save him all to shower his golden child with a lifestyle she had never earned. He had looked me in the eye in the pouring rain just hours ago and told me my sister needed winners. He had discarded me without a single second thought. A profound, burning anger ignited deep in my chest. It was not the chaotic, noisy anger of a misunderstood teenager. It was the deep, quiet, and terrifying wrath of an adult woman who realizes she holds the absolute power to destroy the people who hurt her. I spent the next several hours working with relentless mechanical precision. I did not shed another tear. I downloaded the entire corporate ledger. I captured high-resolution screenshots of every forged approval signature from my father. I compiled the phantom invoices, the bank routing numbers, and the corresponding social media posts from Chloe that perfectly matched the exact dates and amounts of the embezzled funds. I built an airtight, irrefutable digital dossier of their financial crimes. I uploaded multiple encrypted backups to secure cloud servers. I was not just building a case to confront my family. I was building a case for a federal fraud investigator. By the time I finished organizing the final folder of digital evidence, the sky outside the motel window was beginning to lighten. The heavy, violent rain had slowed to a steady, rhythmic drizzle. The harsh fluorescent sign from the parking lot flickered and buzzed before finally turning off. It was exactly 7 o'clock in the morning. I closed my laptop and rubbed my exhausted, burning eyes. My body ached terribly from sitting in the rigid plastic chair all night. I felt entirely hollowed out, as if the family I had known my entire life had been completely erased, replaced by greedy, unrecognizable strangers wearing their faces. The betrayal was so absolute, so thoroughly and coldly calculated, that it literally made my chest physically ache. I stood up to stretch my stiff legs, walking slowly toward the small window, to look out at the gray morning light. I needed to call my corporate attorney, Samantha. I needed to initiate the legal process of freezing their company accounts and revoking their executive privileges. I needed to officially take back my company. Just as I turned toward the desk to retrieve my phone, the screen lit up brightly in the dim room. A loud, jarring ringtone broke the morning silence. I stared at the caller identification flashing on the screen. It was my mother. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen in the center of the cheap motel room. A tiny, pathetic, completely irrational part of my heart sparked with sudden hope. She was calling at 7 in the morning. Maybe she had spent the entire night lying awake, consumed by overwhelming guilt. Maybe she had realized how truly monstrous it was to throw her own daughter out into a freezing storm. Maybe she was calling to apologize, to beg me to come back home, to tell me that firing me and evicting me had been a terrible, unforgivable mistake. I walked over to the desk and picked up the phone. My hand was trembling slightly as I swiped the screen to accept the call. I brought the phone to my ear, waiting to hear her voice soften with regret. I was waiting for the apology that might have changed everything. I was entirely wrong. The drive to Nantucket was the longest of my life. I parked my 10-year-old sedan a block away from the sprawling beachfront estate. The salt air whipped through my hair, carrying the distant sound of crashing waves and the much closer sound of a live string quartet. I stood on the cobblestone walkway leading up to the property, taking a slow, deep breath. For 3 years, I had quietly paid the property taxes on this multi-million-dollar home. I had covered the insurance premiums. I had held the legal deed in the name of Apex Holdings to protect my parents from total ruin. And now they were using my property to host a lavish rehearsal dinner for the sister who despised me entirely, funded by money stolen from my company. I walked through the towering wrought iron gates. The estate grounds had been transformed into a breathtaking, opulent wonderland. Thousands of rare white orchids spilled from crystal vases on every single table. I recognized those orchids. I had stared at the $12,000 fraudulent invoice for them just 3 days ago in a cheap motel room. A massive champagne fountain bubbled in the center of the manicured lawn. I recognized that too. It was part of the $35,000 charge my father had disguised as a secure warehousing deposit. Everywhere I looked, I saw the undeniable physical evidence of their corporate embezzlement. The lawn was crowded with over 100 elite guests. The women wore flowing designer silk dresses, and the men wore crisp, tailored linen suits. I saw Blake's family, the Caldwells, holding court near the edge of the patio. They were old money dripping with generational wealth and absolute arrogance. Blake's mother was inspecting the floral arrangements with a critical eye, while his father casually swirled a glass of vintage scotch. And right in the middle of it all were my parents. Richard and Susan were playing their roles with sickening perfection. My mother was laughing loudly, her hand resting on the arm of a prominent local politician, acting exactly like the wealthy coastal matriarch she always pretended to be. My father was holding a crystal tumbler, puffing out his chest as he regaled a group of wealthy investors with fabricated stories about his brilliant leadership at Sterling Supply Company. They were soaking in the admiration. They were reveling in their stolen prestige. They looked completely carefree, absolutely certain that their troublesome plain daughter was currently sobbing in a cheap motel, completely broken and permanently out of their way. They did not expect the woman who walked up the stone pathway. I did not look like the exhausted, defeated burden they had thrown out into the freezing rain. I was not wearing my usual oversized sweaters or faded, sensible shoes. I was wearing a sharp, meticulously tailored navy blue power suit. My hair was sleek and pulled back. My posture was perfectly straight. In my right hand, I carried the heavy leather briefcase containing the absolute destruction of their entire world. I did not walk like a guest who was lucky to be invited. I walked like the landlord stepping onto her own property. The string quartet was playing a soft classical melody, but the music seemed to fade as I stepped onto the main wooden deck of the patio. A few heads turned. Conversations nearby stuttered and died. The contrast between my sharp, dark business attire and their breezy beach formal wear made me stand out like a beacon. It took exactly 30 seconds for my sister to spot me. Chloe was standing near the champagne fountain, wearing a custom white silk gown that clung to her perfectly. She was laughing at a joke one of Blake's groomsmen had made. Then her eyes shifted across the deck and locked onto me. I watched the color instantly drain from her face. The radiant, glowing bride vanished, replaced by a terrified, deeply angry child. She whispered something to her bridesmaids and immediately broke away from the group. She marched across the wooden deck, her heels clicking sharply. She kept a bright, frozen smile on her face for the benefit of the surrounding guests. But as she reached me, her eyes were burning with pure venom. "What in the world are you doing here?" Chloe hissed, keeping her voice incredibly low so the Caldwells would not hear. "I explicitly told you that you were banned from this property. You are going to completely ruin my aesthetic." I looked at her calmly, feeling the solid weight of my leather briefcase. "I am here for a business meeting, Chloe." "Are you out of your mind?" she snapped, grabbing my arm and trying to pull me toward the shadows of the catering tent. "You look like a depressed corporate drone. Blake's parents are standing right over there. They think we are a successful, high-class family. I will not let you embarrass me in front of them with your pathetic, desperate cry for attention. If you are here to beg Mom and Dad for your miserable accounting job back, you need to go around the back and use the service entrance. Stand by the dumpsters until they have time to deal with you." I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm. I smoothed the fabric of my navy sleeve. "I am not here to beg for anything," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "And I will not be using the service entrance of my own volition." Before Chloe could launch into another hysterical whisper, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I turned to find my father standing there. Richard was sweating heavily under the collar of his expensive linen suit. His eyes darted nervously toward the Caldwell family, terrified that they might witness this unscripted family drama. He quickly pulled me away from Chloe and backed me into a quiet corner near the outdoor bar, shielding me from the main crowd. "What are you doing walking through the front gates?" he demanded, his voice thick with a mixture of overwhelming stress and his usual arrogant entitlement. "I thought you had enough sense to come through the back." He did not wait for my answer. His eyes immediately dropped to the heavy leather briefcase in my right hand. A look of greedy, desperate relief washed over his face. "Do you have the tax documents?" he asked urgently, holding his hand out expectantly. "The forged papers. Did you bring them?" He was talking about the fraudulent tax returns he had tried to extort me into creating. He believed I had spent the last 3 days sitting in a motel room forging federal tax documents so he could illegally secure a second mortgage on this beach house to cover the frozen corporate accounts. He truly believed he had broken me. I looked at his outstretched hand. I looked at the sweat beading on his forehead. He needed that fake paperwork to survive. He thought it was his absolute salvation. I smiled. It was a genuine, terrifying smile. "I have every single document you deserve, Richard." He let out a heavy sigh of relief, completely missing the cold threat in my tone. "Good," he muttered, wiping his brow with a cocktail napkin. "I knew you would eventually come to your senses and remember your duty to this family. Hand the briefcase over to me right now. If you do this quietly without making a scene, I will generously allow you to sleep in the garden shed tonight. Tomorrow morning you can pack your bags and go find a new life somewhere else. But right now, you need to hand me that briefcase and get out of sight." He reached forward to grab the leather handle from my grip. I stepped back, pulling the briefcase tightly against my side. "Not yet," I said clearly. My father glared at me, his face flushing dark red. Claire, do not play games with me right now. The bank needs these forms first thing Monday morning. Give me the damn briefcase before you ruin everything. Suddenly, a loud, sharp ringing sound echoed across the patio. Someone was tapping a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The low hum of conversation across the sprawling lawn quickly faded into expectant silence. I looked past my father's shoulder. Blake had stepped up onto a small elevated wooden platform near the ocean edge. He was holding a microphone in one hand and a glass of vintage champagne in the other. He looked incredibly smug, radiating the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully stolen a multi-million-dollar fortune. My father turned around, his irritation briefly masked by a forced, proud smile. He turned back to me and pointed a stern finger at my chest. "Stay right here," he commanded in a harsh whisper. "Do not move a single muscle. We will finish this transaction as soon as Blake is done speaking." I did not answer him. I just watched the stage. "Thank you, everyone." Blake began, his voice booming effortlessly over the high-quality sound system. "Thank you all for joining us on this spectacular evening in Nantucket." The crowd offered a polite, warm applause. Chloe walked up to the edge of the stage, gazing up at him with absolute adoration. "I want to take a moment to thank my wonderful parents for being here," Blake continued, gesturing toward the Caldwells. "And of course, I have to give my deepest, most profound gratitude to my future in-laws Richard and Susan Sterling." My parents beamed from the crowd. Susan wiped a fake tear from her eye. Richard puffed out his chest, looking like the ultimate triumphant patriarch. "Richard and Susan have not just welcomed me into their beautiful family," Blake declared, his voice dripping with arrogant pride. "They have welcomed me into their legacy. As the new Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Supply Company, I am incredibly honored to help lead our family empire into a new era of massive prosperity. Richard has built a flawless financial machine, and together we are going to take this company to heights it has never seen before. We are building a dynasty, and this gorgeous beach house is just the beginning." The sheer breathtaking audacity of his words sent a jolt of pure electricity straight through my veins. He was standing on my property, drinking champagne paid for with my money, bragging about managing a company that I entirely owned, and taking credit for a financial machine that I had personally built with my own life savings. They were celebrating my destruction. They were toasting to my absolute ruin. My father turned back to me in the shadows of the bar, holding out his hand one more time. "The speech is wrapping up," he whispered aggressively. "Give me the briefcase, Claire. Now." I looked at his demanding, greedy hand. I looked at the man who had traded his daughter's future for a country club membership. "No," I said quietly. Before my father could process the absolute defiance in my voice, I stepped around him. He reached out to grab my arm, but I was already moving. I walked out of the shadows and straight into the fading golden sunlight of the patio. My heels clicked sharply against the wooden deck, establishing a steady, undeniable rhythm. The crowd was still clapping for Blake's pompous speech, but as I moved through the center of the gathering, the applause began to falter. People stepped aside, confused by the sudden appearance of a woman in a dark business suit, marching toward the stage with the sheer intensity of an approaching hurricane. I saw my mother drop her champagne flute. It shattered against the deck, but she did not even look down. She was staring at me in pure horror. I saw Chloe freeze her eyes wide with mounting panic as she realized I was not walking toward the service exit. I did not stop. I did not hesitate. I walked directly past my father, past my mother, and past my terrified sister. I ascended the 3 short wooden steps onto the elevated platform. Blake was still smiling, completely oblivious to the shifting energy in the crowd. He turned toward me as I stepped up beside him, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He opened his mouth to ask me what I was doing. I did not give him the chance to speak. I reached out, wrapped my hand around the heavy metal microphone, and forcefully pulled it straight out of his arrogant grasp. The heavy metal microphone felt incredibly cold against my palm as I pulled it forcefully from Blake's grip. A sharp, high-pitched screech of audio feedback pierced the salty evening air, cutting through the rhythmic sound of the crashing ocean waves. The sudden noise was like a physical shockwave. The polite, wealthy chatter of the 100 elite guests gathered on the manicured lawn died instantly. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing their bows, hovering awkwardly over their instruments. Blake stumbled back a step, his perfectly styled hair suddenly looking slightly out of place. His arrogant smile dissolved into a mask of pure, unfiltered confusion. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to make a charming joke to smooth over the awkward interruption, but the look in my eyes completely silenced him. I did not look like the timid, exhausted sister he was used to ignoring. I looked like a woman who was about to burn his entire world to the ground. I turned my back to Blake and faced the crowd. I stood perfectly straight at the wooden podium, looking out over the sea of designer silk dresses and custom linen suits. I made direct eye contact with Blake's wealthy parents, the Caldwells, who were standing near the front of the crowd with their champagne flutes suspended in midair. "Good evening, everyone," I said. My voice was steady, resonant, and completely devoid of fear. The professional, clinical tone I used in high-stakes financial audits echoed flawlessly across the sprawling beachfront estate. My name is Claire Adams. I know most of you have only been introduced to me as Chloe's older sister, or perhaps you were not introduced to me at all, but I am not standing up here tonight in a family capacity. I am standing up here in a strictly professional one. A thick, suffocating silence settled over the patio. No one dared to take a sip of their drinks. No one dared to whisper. I could see the absolute terror dawning on my father's face in the shadows near the outdoor bar. He took a frantic step forward, his hands raised desperately, trying to signal me to stop. I ignored him completely. First, I continued my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the guests. I would like to publicly thank Richard Adams and Blake Caldwell for their recent and entirely temporary service to Sterling Supply Company. A ripple of profound confusion moved through the crowd. Blake's mother frowned, exchanging a bewildered glance with her husband. Blake let out a nervous, breathless chuckle behind me, completely unsure of how to react to the phrase, temporary service. My mother, standing frozen near the lavish floral displays she had purchased with stolen money, turned the color of chalk. I lifted my heavy leather briefcase and placed it squarely on top of the wooden podium. The dual brass locks echoed with two sharp, decisive clicks as I snapped them open. Earlier this evening, I said, leaning closer to the microphone, my father asked me to bring him a stack of highly sensitive documents. He demanded that I secretly deliver them to him right here at this beautiful rehearsal dinner. He told me that if I handed over these documents quietly, he would generously allow me to sleep in the garden shed out back, because last night he threw me out of my home and told me I was dead weight. A collective, audible gasp swept through the elite crowd. The Caldwells stared at my father, their expressions shifting from confusion to outright horror. My father was entirely paralyzed, completely stripped of his arrogant, wealthy patriarch persona. He looked like a cornered animal trapped in the glaring spotlight of his own high society event. He asked me to bring him backdated forged corporate tax returns, I announced, letting the words strike the crowd like a physical blow. He needed me, his former senior accountant, to falsify federal tax documents so he could illegally secure a second high-interest mortgage on this magnificent Nantucket beach house. He needed that fraudulent loan because the corporate bank accounts for Sterling Supply Company were suddenly and mysteriously frozen this morning. The silence on the patio was so profound that I could hear the gentle rustle of the seagrass in the wind. Blake's father lowered his glass of vintage scotch, his eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits as he stared at Blake. But I did not bring forged tax documents tonight. I continued, reaching my hand into the open briefcase. I pulled out a thick stack of crisp, legally binding paperwork bearing the heavy embossed seals of my corporate attorneys. I held the documents up for the entire crowd to see. These are not tax forms, I stated with absolute, unyielding precision. These are immediate, non-negotiable termination notices for gross financial misconduct. Blake let out a strangled, panicked sound. He lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone back from me. "Claire, shut your mouth right now," he hissed aggressively. "You are completely insane. You have absolutely no authority to fire anyone. Richard is the chief executive officer." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I turned my head slowly and looked Blake directly in the eyes. "Richard is a salaried employee," I said coldly, "and so are you. Or rather, you were until 5 minutes ago." I turned back to the crowd, projecting my voice over the sound of the ocean. My father has spent the last 3 years parading around this town, boasting about the massive Chicago private equity firm that supposedly bailed his failing logistics company out of bankruptcy. He told you all that he was retained as a brilliant executive to steer the ship. He lied to you. There is no private equity firm in Chicago. I paused, letting the weight of my words hang in the salty air. 3 years ago, Sterling Supply Company was completely bankrupt. To save my family from total ruin, I quietly liquidated my entire life savings. I drained my retirement accounts. I took every single penny I had ever earned and I created an anonymous blind trust called Apex Holdings. I looked directly at my father. He was gripping the edge of the bar, his knuckles stark white, his chest heaving as the illusion he had built his entire identity upon was ripped away in front of his wealthy friends. I am the sole owner of Apex Holdings. I declared, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. I bought the corporate debt. I own Sterling Supply Company, and I own the legal deed to this Nantucket beach house you are currently standing in. I put the property in my holding company's name to save it from bank foreclosure. My father does not own an empire. He simply works for me. The crowd erupted into chaotic, overlapping whispers. Blake's mother dropped her designer clutch onto the wooden deck. Chloe was visibly trembling, clutching the skirt of her custom white silk gown as if the fabric could somehow shield her from the devastating reality. The wealthy, untouchable facade the Addams family had projected to the world had just been violently shattered. But I was not finished. The most important part of the audit had not yet been presented. If my father and Blake had simply done their jobs, I would have gladly remained the quiet accountant in the background. I continued speaking over the rising murmurs of the crowd. But over the last 3 months, they decided to treat the company I sacrificed everything to save as their own personal slush fund. They fired me yesterday because the end of the fiscal quarter is approaching, and they knew I would conduct a mandatory financial reconciliation. They knew I would find the money they stole. I pulled a second stack of papers from my briefcase. These were the digital dossiers, the printed screenshots, and the bank routing numbers I had spent the entire night compiling in that freezing motel room. I have spent the last 12 hours conducting a comprehensive forensic audit of the executive ledgers I announced. I want to share exactly how your hosts have been funding this beautiful wedding weekend. I held up the first printed invoice. $24,000 was wired from the corporate operating account to a luxury resort management group in the Bahamas. I read loudly, ensuring every single guest could hear the exact numbers. The expense was fraudulently coded by Blake Caldwell as a corporate leadership and team-building retreat. In reality, it funded Chloe's extravagant 2-week bachelorette party. Chloe let out a loud, humiliated sob and covered her face with her hands. The bridesmaids standing near her instantly took a collective step backward, physically distancing themselves from the glowing bride who had just been exposed as a common thief. I held up the second document. $35,000 was wired to Maritime Logistics Solutions. I continued, my voice steady and relentless. It was coded as secure warehousing deposits. But Maritime Logistics Solutions is not a warehouse. It is the premier yacht charter service right here in Nantucket. It is the exact same yacht you are all scheduled to board for the rehearsal cruise tomorrow afternoon. I looked down at the massive, cascading floral arrangements decorating the edge of the stage. $12,000 was sent to a boutique European importer for warehouse supplies and seasonal inventory, I said, gesturing toward the rare white orchids. Those warehouse supplies are currently sitting in crystal vases on your dinner tables. I dropped the stack of invoices onto the podium. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was final and definitive. In total, Richard Addams and Blake Caldwell have aggressively and deliberately embezzled over $120,000 from my company in just 90 days, I concluded. They drained the operational reserves to fund a lavish high society fantasy. That is why their corporate platinum cards were completely declined at the country club this morning. That is why the premium wine vendor is currently threatening to cancel the reception order. I froze their access because I do not finance criminals, and I absolutely refuse to pay for a wedding built entirely on stolen money. The silence that followed was entirely different from the silence that had begun my speech. It was a heavy, suffocating silence of absolute revulsion. The elite guests, the powerful politicians, and the wealthy investors were staring at my family with unmasked disgust. In their world, losing money was a tragedy, but stealing it to fake a wealthy lifestyle was an unforgivable, catastrophic sin. My mother, Susan, suddenly realized that her entire social standing, her reputation, and her carefully cultivated image had been completely annihilated in the span of 5 minutes. She knew there was absolutely no way to argue with the meticulous paper trail I had just exposed. She knew she could not charm her way out of federal fraud allegations. So she did the only thing she knew how to do when she was losing control. She played the victim. Susan let out a loud, theatrical, breathy gasp. She brought the back of her manicured hand dramatically to her forehead. She swayed on her expensive heels, her eyes fluttering shut as she let her body collapse backward toward the wooden deck. She fully expected a crowd of concerned guests to rush forward, catch her in their arms, and beg for someone to call a doctor, distracting everyone from the devastating truth I had just dropped on them. No one moved to catch her. The wealthy guests, standing directly behind her, simply took a wide, synchronized step backward, completely clearing a path. My mother hit the hard wooden deck of the patio with a heavy, undignified thud. Her expensive silk dress bunched up awkwardly around her knees. She lay there on the ground for a few seconds, her eyes tightly closed, waiting for the sympathetic gasps and the rushing footsteps that never came. The humiliation was absolute. It was pure, unadulterated devastation. Susan slowly opened one eye, realizing her performance had completely failed. She saw the Caldwell family looking down at her with expressions of sheer contempt. Blake's mother literally turned her head away in disgust. Susan awkwardly scrambled to pull her dress down and sit up, her face burning a bright, ugly crimson. She looked ridiculous. She looked small. I stood at the podium, looking down at the people who had told me I was a burden just 24 hours ago. My father was gripping the edge of the bar, completely broken. My mother was sitting on the floor, stripped of all her pride. My sister was weeping uncontrollably, watching her wealthy future in-laws back away from her fiancé. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I had carried their weight for 31 years. I had sacrificed my own security to keep them warm. I had absorbed their insults, moved my car so they could park in the prime spots, and lived in a shed so they could host garden parties. They had taken everything I gave them, and when they thought I had nothing left to offer, they threw me out into the rain. They wanted to be surrounded by winners. They wanted a life of luxury and power. Instead, they were standing in the ruins of their own greed, completely exposed and entirely ruined. I picked up my leather briefcase, snapped the brass lock shut, and prepared to deliver the final crushing legal blow that would officially remove them from my property forever. The heavy silence hanging over the opulent Nantucket patio was suddenly broken by the sharp crunch of footsteps on the cobblestone walkway. After the bombshell I had just dropped, the 100 elite guests were completely paralyzed, staring at my family with a mixture of shock and utter disgust. But the sound of purposeful, synchronized footsteps drawing closer pulled every single eye toward the grand, wrought iron gates of the estate. I did not need to look to know who was arriving. I had timed this perfectly. Walking through the garden arches was Samantha, my fierce and brilliantly ruthless corporate attorney. She was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase and radiating absolute authority. But Samantha was not alone. Flanking her on either side were 4 men and 2 women wearing dark windbreakers. Stamped across the backs and chests of those jackets in bold white lettering were the initials of the State Financial Fraud Investigation Unit. The visual contrast was staggering. Here in the middle of a multi-million-dollar high society rehearsal dinner, surrounded by rare white orchids and a bubbling champagne fountain, law enforcement had arrived to collect their dues. The sea of wealthy guests parted immediately. No one wanted to be standing anywhere near my family when the authorities stepped onto the deck. The politicians, the investors, and the old money socialites practically scrambled backward, clearing a wide path straight from the gate to the elevated wooden stage where I stood. Samantha walked right up to the base of the podium. She offered me a single crisp nod of acknowledgement before turning her piercing gaze entirely onto Blake. Blake was still standing next to me, clutching his empty champagne glass. His perfectly styled hair was catching the ocean breeze, but his face had turned the color of wet ash. He looked like a man who was watching his entire universe collapse in real time. "Blake Caldwell," Samantha said, her voice cutting through the salty evening air like a freshly sharpened blade. "I am the lead legal counsel for Apex Holdings. You are being officially detained for questioning regarding multiple counts of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the unauthorized diversion of company assets. The investigators standing behind me have already secured warrants to freeze your personal bank accounts and seize your digital devices." Blake let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp. He dropped his crystal champagne flute. It hit the wooden deck and shattered into a dozen glittering pieces, but nobody even blinked. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the hem of Chloe's custom white silk gown. He frantically looked out into the crowd, his eyes darting wildly until they locked onto his wealthy parents. "Dad," Blake pleaded, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "Dad, you have to do something. Call our lawyers. Tell them this is a massive misunderstanding. Tell them it is just a corporate accounting error. I did not steal anything. Richard told me to sign those invoices." My father flinched violently at the accusation, stepping away from the bar, as if the wood had suddenly caught fire. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to throw Blake under the bus, but he was silenced by the absolute freezing contempt radiating from Blake's father. Mr. Caldwell stepped forward, his posture rigid and his expression carved from stone. He was a man of generational wealth, a man whose entire life was built on pristine reputation and flawless public perception. He looked at his son not with love or concern or a desire to protect him. He looked at him as if he were a disgusting, foul-smelling stain on their family legacy. "Do not drag my name into your pathetic criminal behavior," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice echoing with devastating finality. "You have humiliated this family for the absolute last time. We will not be spending a single dime of our money to defend a common thief. You are entirely on your own." Blake's mother, draped in expensive diamonds and a flowing designer dress, stepped up directly beside her husband. She looked at my mother, who was still sitting awkwardly on the wooden floor after her failed fake fainting spell. The disgust in Mrs. Caldwell's eyes was absolute. "There will be no wedding tomorrow," Mrs. Caldwell announced to the silent crowd. Her voice was loud, clear, and totally void of emotion. "The Caldwell family officially severs all ties with the Addams family effective immediately. We apologize to our friends who traveled for this absolute circus. We are leaving this island tonight." Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. She fell to her knees, clutching her white silk dress, sobbing hysterically as she watched her wealthy future in-laws turn their backs and march proudly down the cobblestone path. The elite guests who had traveled with the Caldwells immediately followed suit. The patio began to empty rapidly, a mass exodus of high society fleeing a sinking ship. Two of the fraud investigators calmly walked up the wooden steps onto the stage. They did not use handcuffs, likely trying to maintain some small shred of decorum, but they firmly grasped Blake's arms and guided him down the stairs. Blake was crying now, begging anyone who would listen to believe that he was just following my father's orders. His pleas fell on deaf ears as they escorted him off the property, leading him toward the unmarked vehicles waiting outside the gates. The grand, opulent party was officially a wasteland. The string quartet was frantically packing their instruments. The catering staff was quietly removing the expensive appetizers from the tables, and in the center of the ruins stood my father. Richard Addams watched the wealthy guests abandon him. He watched the Caldwells march out the gate. He watched his golden child sobbing on the floor. For a moment, he looked completely broken. But then, as he turned his gaze up toward me standing at the podium, that brokenness mutated into a terrifying, explosive rage. He charged forward, marching right up to the base of the stage. His face was purple with fury, the veins popping visibly in his neck. "You ungrateful, treacherous witch!" my father screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You planned this. You deliberately waited until the rehearsal dinner to humiliate me in front of my investors. You think you are so smart. You think you hold all the cards just because you played some sneaky accounting tricks." I looked down at him calmly, my hands resting lightly on my leather briefcase. "I did not play any tricks, Richard. I just stopped hiding your crimes." "You have absolutely no right to be on this property," he roared, his voice echoing off the side of the massive house. "I do not care what imaginary trust you think you own. This is my house. My name is on the original mortgage. I bought this land. You are trespassing on my estate, and I am going to have the local police physically drag you out of here right now." Samantha stepped forward before I could even reply. She calmly unzipped her leather portfolio and withdrew a thick stack of heavy watermarked documents. She held them out toward my father with the cool, detached precision of a surgeon. "Mr. Adams," Samantha said, her voice perfectly level, "you do not own this property. You have not owned this property for 3 years. When Apex Holdings paid off your defaulted mortgage to save this estate from bank foreclosure, the legal deed was permanently and irrevocably transferred into the trust." My father snatched the papers from her hand. His eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon, desperately searching for a loophole, a mistake, anything he could use to maintain his delusion of power. "You have been living here, hosting parties here, and playing the wealthy magnate entirely at the pleasure of my client," Samantha continued smoothly. "Apex Holdings holds the exclusive title, and as you have just been informed, Claire Adams is the sole owner and supreme administrator of Apex Holdings. This house belongs entirely to her. You are nothing more than a guest who has vastly overstayed his welcome." I watched the exact moment my father realized the terrifying truth. The paperwork was ironclad. There were no loopholes. His eyes stopped moving. The purple rage in his face slowly drained away, leaving behind a pale, sickening gray. The reality of his situation crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He was completely broke. He was facing federal fraud charges, and the multi-million-dollar beach house he loved more than his own daughter actually belonged to me. I stepped down from the wooden platform, closing the distance between us. I stood just 2 feet away from the man who had tormented me for my entire life. My mother had finally managed to pick herself up off the floor. She scurried over to my father's side, clutching his arm, her eyes wide with mounting terror. Chloe was still weeping near the champagne fountain, her perfect wedding completely vaporized. I looked at the three of them. I looked at the family who had spent 31 years telling me I was useless, telling me I was a burden, telling me I was only valuable when I was sacrificing my own happiness for their comfort. I remembered the freezing rain lashing against my face last night. I remembered the heavy weight of my suitcase as I dragged it down the wet asphalt driveway after they threw me away like garbage. "You told me last night that this family only needed winners," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper that forced them to lean in to hear me. "You told me I was a liability. You told me I had 1 hour to pack my things and get off your property." My mother let out a small, pathetic whimper. "Claire, please," she begged, her voice shaking with tears. "Please do not do this. We are your family. We are your blood." "Blood loyalty only matters when you need a personal loan to buy wine," I replied coldly, throwing her own toxic words right back at her. I turned my attention back to my father. He could not even look me in the eye. He was staring at the wooden deck, completely defeated. "This is my property," I announced, my voice growing louder, echoing with absolute, unyielding finality. "And as the legal owner of this estate, I am officially terminating your status as guests. You are now officially trespassing." Chloe let out another loud wail, burying her face in her hands. "I am going to give you exactly what you gave me." I continued, pointing my finger toward the massive front doors of the sprawling beach house. "I am giving you exactly 2 hours. You have 2 hours to go inside, pack whatever clothes you can fit into your suitcases, and get off my property. You are not to take a single piece of furniture, a single piece of art, or a single bottle of wine. If you are not completely off this estate by 9 o'clock tonight, Samantha will instruct the local authorities to arrest all 3 of you for criminal trespassing." My father slowly raised his head. His eyes were completely hollow. "Where are we supposed to go?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "The corporate accounts are frozen. Our personal accounts are linked to the business. We have absolutely no money. We have nowhere to sleep tonight." I looked at him, feeling absolutely no pity. "That sounds like a terrible financial crisis, Richard. I suggest you go find a cheap roadside motel. I hear the plastic chairs are incredibly comfortable when you have to sit in them all night." I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not wait to see them scramble. I walked past the remaining catering staff who were quietly and quickly dismantling the extravagant buffet tables. I walked past the bubbling champagne fountain and the thousands of wasted white orchids. I walked straight through the grand double doors of my beach house and headed directly for the master suite on the 3rd floor. The master bedroom had a massive wraparound balcony that overlooked the front driveway and the long cobblestone path leading to the main gates. I stepped out into the cool evening air. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, painting the Nantucket sky in deep shades of purple and bruised blue. The crash of the ocean waves sounded different from up here. It sounded steady, powerful, and incredibly peaceful. I stood by the glass railing and looked down. The frantic, humiliating scramble had already begun. The driveway was dimly lit by the outdoor security lights, casting long, erratic shadows across the asphalt. I watched my father drag 3 massive, heavy suitcases out the front door, his shoulders hunched, completely stripped of his arrogant posture. I watched my mother carrying armfuls of expensive designer coats, crying hysterically as she shoved them aggressively into the trunk of their least luxury car. I watched Chloe trailing behind them, still wearing her ruined white silk gown, carrying a cardboard box full of expensive makeup and wedding favors. They were frantically stuffing their lives into trash bags and suitcases in the dark, absolutely terrified of the 2-hour deadline ticking down. They were bumping into each other, snapping at each other, the beautiful illusion of their perfect high society family completely shattered by the reality of their own greed. I stood there in the cool night breeze, watching the people who had hurt me pack up their bags and prepare to disappear from my life forever. And as I watched them load the final suitcase into the trunk, I felt a physical sensation spread through my entire body. It felt like a massive, suffocating weight was actively unspooling from my spine. For 31 years, I had carried the crushing burden of their expectations. I had carried the guilt of never being pretty enough, never being glamorous enough, never being the golden child. I had accepted the role of the quiet, dependable scapegoat, believing that if I just worked hard enough and sacrificed enough, they would eventually love me. I had drained my life savings to rescue them, hoping it would finally prove my worth. But watching them drive away in the dark, fleeing the property they tried to steal, I finally understood the truth. I was never the broken one. I was never the liability. I was the absolute foundation that held their entire fragile world together. And the moment I decided to step away, their world immediately collapsed into dust. The heavy luxury car started its engine. The headlights flipped on, cutting through the dark driveway. I watched as my father put the car in gear and slowly drove toward the main gates. They did not look back. They did not stop. They simply rolled out into the night, driving away to face the federal fraud investigators and the absolute ruin of their own making. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the salty ocean air. The house behind me was completely silent. It was empty. It was finally mine. I rested my hands on the cool glass of the balcony railing and looked up at the stars beginning to pierce the dark sky. The 31 years of guilt, the endless parentification, and the agonizing need for their approval evaporated completely into the ocean breeze. I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was free. The first week following the rehearsal dinner felt like waking up from a 30-year nightmare. I woke up each morning in the master suite of the Nantucket beach house, listening to the rhythmic, soothing sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline. There was no screaming. There was no belittling. There was no constant demand for me to fix a crisis I did not create. The island of Nantucket is a very small and very connected community. Gossip travels faster than the coastal wind. By what was supposed to be the wedding day, the entire town knew exactly what had happened on my patio. The vendors who had been screaming for their money were paid directly by Apex Holdings, but only for the legitimate services already rendered. The massive yacht charter, the imported orchids, and the celebrity caterers were firmly canceled. I donated the prepared food to a local shelter and gave the thousands of flowers to a community center. The perfect wedding day came and went without a single piece of confetti being thrown. I spent that Saturday walking along the beach, feeling the warm sand beneath my feet and breathing in the clean salt air. I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. The massive burden of pretending to be a dutiful, silent daughter to people who despised me had finally been lifted from my shoulders. While I was breathing clean air for the first time, my father and Blake were suffocating under the crushing weight of a federal fraud investigation. Samantha, my corporate attorney, did not hold back. She was ruthless and perfectly efficient. She handed over every single bite of the digital dossier I had compiled during that long freezing night in the motel. The fraud investigators had the forged invoices, the fake vendor accounts, the bank routing numbers, and the direct, undeniable link to the luxury spending. My father tried to use his old executive intimidation tactics on the federal agents, treating them like subordinate employees, but you cannot bluff your way out of a heavily documented paper trail. Because the total amount stolen exceeded $120,000, the charges were incredibly severe. My father only managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence because he panicked, pleaded guilty immediately, and agreed to a brutal, humiliating plea deal. He was sentenced to 5 years of severe, highly monitored legal probation. He was forced to wear an ankle monitor and report his every movement. More importantly, he was hit with crippling financial restitution and massive legal fines that completely drained whatever hidden personal savings he had left. He was legally barred from ever holding an executive corporate position or managing company finances again. His reputation as a brilliant self-made logistics magnate was completely obliterated. He was permanently blacklisted from every country club, every investment circle, and every boardroom in the state. Blake suffered an equally spectacular destruction. When the Caldwell family fully realized the depth of his criminal entitlement and the public embarrassment he had caused them, they completely severed him from their generational wealth. They legally cut him out of their estate to protect their own pristine public image. With his fraud charges plastered across the local business journals, Blake found his career permanently radioactive. No reputable company would ever hire a disgraced, documented corporate thief. The golden boy who had stood on my wooden deck bragging about his glorious empire was now completely unemployable, utterly broke, and entirely disgraced. He packed his bags and left the state, abandoning my sister without a second thought the moment the money dried up. With their corporate platinum cards permanently canceled and their personal bank accounts frozen or drained to pay for their criminal defense lawyers, my parents and my sister had nowhere left to hide. They could no longer afford the leased luxury cars, the designer clothes, or the expensive restaurant dinners. They had absolutely zero income and a massive mountain of legal debt. The poetic justice of their new living situation was almost too perfect to believe. Having been violently evicted from my multi-million-dollar beach estate, they were forced to find the absolute cheapest housing available on short notice. They ended up moving into a tiny, cramped, faded roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. It was the exact same motel they had driven me toward when they threw me out into the freezing rain just a week earlier. I could perfectly picture them crammed into that single depressing room. I could see the faded brown carpet, the sagging mattresses, and the lingering smell of harsh cleaning chemicals and stale smoke. My mother, a woman who once threw a massive temper tantrum if her vintage champagne was not perfectly chilled, was now heating up canned soup in a cheap microwave. My father, the proud patriarch who measured his entire human worth by his zip code and his tailored suits, was now sleeping on a scratchy polyester bedspread. And Chloe, the glowing bride who was supposed to be honeymooning in a private beachfront villa in the Bahamas, was trapped in a single room with the parents who had enabled her absolute ruin. They were finally living the exact life they had callously tried to force onto me. They were learning what it felt like to be entirely discarded by the world. They held out for exactly 8 days before their desperation completely eroded their stubborn pride. The communication arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was sitting on my master balcony, drinking a cup of hot coffee, when my phone chimed with a long, rambling email from my mother. Her tone was entirely different from the harsh, demanding voice she had used to try and extort me into a personal loan for wedding wine. Now, she was playing the role of the heartbroken, deeply misunderstood matriarch. She wrote page after page of desperate apologies, claiming that the immense stress of the wedding planning had completely clouded their judgment. She blamed the terrible economy, the pressure of maintaining appearances in their social circle, and the manipulative bad influence of Blake. She tried to rewrite history, suggesting that they always intended to pay the money back to the company accounts once the wedding was over. She begged for my forgiveness, using the exact same emotional manipulation tactics she had used to control me my entire life. She wrote that family is family, that blood is thicker than water, and that we desperately needed to stick together during this terrible hardship. She ended the lengthy email by asking if I could please send them a small cash advance to help them secure a basic rental apartment, promising that things would be completely different if I just gave them one more chance to prove their love. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed with a text message from Chloe. It was a frantic, pathetic plea. She typed that Blake had completely abandoned her, that he was totally broke and ignoring all of her calls. She said her life was entirely ruined. Her former high society friends were laughing at her behind her back, and she had absolutely nowhere to go. She begged me for a personal loan, claiming she just needed enough money to get away from our parents and start a new life somewhere else. She promised she would pay me back the moment she found a job. I sat on the balcony looking out at the endless blue ocean, and I read their messages over and over. I waited to feel the familiar, suffocating wave of guilt. I waited for that old, deeply ingrained instinct to kick in, the instinct that told me it was my absolute duty to sacrifice my own happiness to save them from the consequences of their actions. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no guilt. There was no feeling of obligation. There was only a profound, crystal clear, clinical detachment. They were not apologizing because they were genuinely sorry for treating me like an unloved servant. They were not apologizing because they regretted stealing my money or trying to ruin my credit. They were only apologizing because they had been caught, because their elite friends had abandoned them, and because I was the only person left on earth who had the resources to bail them out. They did not want a loving daughter or a supportive sister. They just wanted an open wallet to fund their delusions. I opened the reply window to the email and added the phone number to the response string. I did not write a long emotional paragraph. I did not explain my feelings or list their countless failures as a family. They did not deserve my emotional energy or my explanations. I typed a single simple sentence, throwing my father's cruel parting words directly back into their faces. I only keep winners around me, and I do not have the budget to carry dead weight. I hit send. I did not wait to see if they read it. I immediately went into my phone settings and permanently blocked both of their numbers. I blocked my father's number. I blocked their email addresses. I completely erased their digital footprint from my life. They were gone. Over the next few months, I completely restructured Sterling Supply Company. With the massive drain of embezzlement removed and the toxic executive leadership purged, the business rapidly expanded. I promoted hardworking employees who had been ignored by my father. I implemented fair wages and transparent accounting practices. The company thrived, and Apex Holdings grew stronger every single day. I sold my old, unreliable 10-year-old sedan and bought a safe, comfortable vehicle. I continued living in the beautiful Nantucket beach house, filling the rooms with art and music and friends who actually cared about me. I built a life based on honesty, hard work, and mutual respect. I never heard from my biological family again. I assume they are still living in some cramped apartment, blaming the world for their spectacular downfall. But their lives are no longer my concern. The heavy chains of parentification and financial abuse had been permanently shattered. If you are listening to this and you recognize your own struggles in my story, I want you to know something incredibly important. You do not owe your success to the people who actively try to tear you down. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to exploit your kindness, drain your resources, or treat you like a burden. Setting firm boundaries with toxic family members is not an act of betrayal. It is a necessary act of survival. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, your finances, and your future. You deserve to be surrounded by people who celebrate your victories, not people who view your hard work as a resource to be stolen. Do not let anyone convince you that you are responsible for carrying their dead weight. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If my story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to make the incredibly difficult decision to walk away from toxic family members to save yourself, please drop a comment below and share your experience. Let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Your stories matter, and reading them helps build a community of support. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a future story. Remember, your peace is invaluable, and you get to decide exactly who deserves a seat at your table. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next video. 6 months have passed since that incredible evening on the patio. Today, I am standing in my actual corner office. It is not the cramped, drafty guest house I lived in for 3 years. It is the executive suite on the top floor of the newly rebranded Apex Logistics and Supply. The view from my massive window overlooks the bustling shipping yard, where trucks are constantly loading and unloading. The company is no longer bleeding cash to fund luxury car leases or extravagant Bahamian vacations for entitled daughters. We are profitable, healthy, and growing at an unprecedented rate. I look out over the warehouse floor and see loyal, honest employees who actually respect the work we do. When I took full public control of the company, I promoted the people my father had constantly ignored. I gave massive raises to the warehouse managers who kept this place running, while my father and Blake were out playing golf on the company dime. The atmosphere here is completely different now. There is absolutely no fear. There is no toxic nepotism, and there are no secret ledgers. There is only a team of dedicated professionals building something real. I traded a toxic biological family for a fiercely loyal professional family, and the business flourished because of it. Every Friday afternoon, I leave the office and drive to the Nantucket Beach House. It is truly my house now. I completely redecorated it the moment the legal dust settled. I removed all the pretentious, heavy furniture my mother insisted on keeping to impress her elite friends. I brought in light, airy colors and opened all the windows to let the sea breeze wash away the lingering memories of their intense entitlement. I spend my weekends there not as an invisible servant catering to country club snobs, but as a host to my chosen family. I invite my closest friends, colleagues who have stood by me, and people who value my presence and not my wallet. We cook dinner together in the massive kitchen. We sit on the wooden deck, drinking affordable wine and laughing until our sides ache. There is no string quartet. There are no thousands of imported white orchids. There is just genuine warmth and absolute peace. The house finally feels like a real home. It is a beautiful sanctuary built on truth, rather than a stage designed to uphold a massive lie. I look back at the 31 years I spent trying to earn my parents' love, and I realize how incredibly dangerous that desperate need can be. I want to speak directly to those of you watching who might be carrying a very similar burden. Many of you have spent decades working incredibly hard. You have built successful careers, you have saved your money, and you have carefully grown your retirement funds and your nest eggs. You did all the right things to ensure you would have a safe and comfortable future. But sometimes the greatest threat to your financial security does not come from a bad economy or a risky real estate investment. Sometimes the absolute greatest threat is sitting right across from you at the family dinner table. We are conditioned from birth to believe that family is everything. We are told that blood loyalty is the most important virtue a person can possess. But I am here to tell you that blind loyalty to entitled, greedy family members will only lead to your own absolute ruin. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones most willing to drain your hard-earned assets. They will look at your life savings and see it as their own personal slush fund. They will manipulate your love using deep psychological guilt and endless obligation to extract every last dollar you have. They will demand that you finance their poor choices, their lavish lifestyles, and their constant financial mistakes. And if you dare to say no, they will brand you as selfish. They will call you a bad parent, a bad sibling, or a bad child. They will threaten to withhold their love or keep your grandchildren away from you, just to force you back into submission. Do not let them do it. You cannot buy love. You cannot purchase genuine respect with a blank check. If your family members only show you affection when you are paying their bills, they do not actually love you. They love what you provide for them. They view you as a walking ATM and not a human being with your own needs and desires. The moment the money stops flowing, their false affection will immediately disappear. I learned this harsh truth the hard way when my own parents threw me out into a freezing storm the very moment they thought my usefulness had run out. They gladly sacrificed my physical safety and my emotional well-being just to maintain their wealthy facade and protect my sister's glamorous aesthetic. Setting firm boundaries and protecting your legal assets is not cruel. It is basic survival. You have every right to protect the money you spent your entire life earning. You have the right to put your home in a trust. You have the right to legally shield your bank accounts from relatives who view your generosity as a permanent payday. Do not let anyone shame you for prioritizing your own financial safety. Do not let entitled heirs guilt you into sacrificing your golden years so they can avoid working hard. You are not obligated to finance your own disrespect. You do not owe your life savings to people who treat you like a burden. Think about the massive sacrifices you made in your 20s, your 30s, and your 40s. Think about the vacations you did not take, the luxury items you did not buy, and the long hours you worked just to build a solid foundation for your future. You did not do all of that just to hand it over to someone who refuses to learn the value of a single dollar. Whether it is an adult child who constantly needs rescuing from their own irresponsibility, or a sibling who always seems to have a brand new financial emergency, you must recognize the pattern of exploitation. Financial abuse within families is incredibly common, and it thrives in dark silence. It thrives on the toxic societal belief that saying no to family is a betrayal. But saying no is often the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and ironically for them. When you constantly bail people out, you rob them of the opportunity to learn resilience. You teach them that their terrible actions do not have real consequences. My father and my sister lived in a complete fantasy world because they never had to face the reality of their own incompetence. The moment I removed the financial safety net, their entire universe collapsed. It was not my fault that they fell. It was their fault for entirely refusing to learn how to stand on their own 2 feet. You are not helping your grown children or your relatives by funding their delusions. You are only delaying their inevitable collision with reality while simultaneously bankrupting your own future. I want you to critically evaluate the people in your inner circle. Look very closely at how they respond when you set a simple boundary. When you tell them you cannot lend them money or co-sign a loan or pay for their extravagant wedding, do they accept your answer with grace and understanding? Or do they throw massive tantrums, hurl vicious insults, and accuse you of not loving them? Their immediate reaction to your boundaries will tell you absolutely everything you need to know about their true character. A person who genuinely cares for you will never want to put you in a position of financial risk or emotional distress. A parasite, however, will violently attack the host when the food supply is permanently cut off. My sister called me a bitter spinster. My father called me deadweight. My mother called me a selfish burden. They used every horrible word they could find to try and force me back into submission. But those words lost all their power the moment I realized they were just desperate, pathetic tactics from weak, greedy people. I stopped internalizing their insults. I stopped believing that I was the problem in the family. I realized that my only crime was being competent, reliable, and far too forgiving. Once I accepted that truth, I was finally able to step into my own power and take back everything they had stolen from me. I highly recommend that everyone watching this takes proactive steps to protect themselves right now. Talk to a reputable estate attorney. Set up your trusts. Make sure your financial directives are ironclad and completely legally binding. Do not rely on verbal agreements or the naive assumption that your family will simply do the right thing when the time comes. Money changes people in terrifying ways. Greed turns siblings into strangers and parents into predators. You must have solid legal armor in place. I used a blind trust to protect my assets, and it was the only thing that stopped my father from completely liquidating my beach home to cover his own criminal tracks. The paperwork I created with my lawyer Samantha was the ultimate shield against their boundless entitlement. Do not wait until a sudden crisis hits to protect your livelihood. Do it now while you are thinking clearly and calmly. The freedom that comes from walking away from toxic family dynamics is completely indescribable. Yes, it is very painful at first. Yes, you will mourn the family you wish you had. You will grieve the parents who should have protected you and the siblings who should have supported you. But once that initial heavy grief passes, you will find a level of peace you never knew existed. You will sleep better. You will smile more. You will find that your daily energy is no longer being constantly drained by manufactured drama and endless financial emergencies. You will finally have the emotional bandwidth to invest in your own happiness and your own future. I look back at the young woman who sat crying in a cheap motel room, terrified that she had lost everything. I wish I could tell her that she was actually gaining the entire world. I am no longer the quiet accountant, hiding in the shadows, trying to buy love with silent, painful sacrifices. I am a successful business owner. I am an independent woman. I am completely secure in my own worth, and I do not need anyone else to validate my existence. I chose myself, and it was the absolute greatest decision I have ever made in my entire life. If you have ever been taken for granted or manipulated out of your hard-earned assets by the very people you trusted most, I want you to know you are not alone. It is never too late to take your power back. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you stories of justice. And drop a comment below. What state are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? If you were in my shoes, would you have let them finish the wedding before dropping the truth? Let me know. Until next time, protect your peace and know your worth.